crowd, all expectant, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Kwasi. I'll introduce him briefly and connect the two of us very peripherally, but this really is Kwasi's show, and then ask him to describe some of the central theses in his book. It's about 500 years, as you know from the title, and that really is a long period of time to collapse in a little bit. And we would like to leave 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A, and I'll interrupt as I see fit. So Kwasi is a very interesting guy. He's a member of parliament in the UK for the last 5 years and is up for re-election. Very exciting. And
none of you can vote for me, unfortunately, unless you live in Spelthorne, which is just outside London.
There you go. And he was a banker prior to this, and it's sort of a rare breed. I think a rare breed, at least judging from the Indian political scene, a cerebral politician. So I'm going to get many Twitter responses about that as soon as the session is over. But he's got economics and globalization and colonial history running in his blood. He's of Ghanaian descent, and so if you read his prior book, which was called Ghosts of Empire, you can see Ghana and the colonies running right through it in many ways. And one of the things I'd love to explore is the connection between the two different books. Now, I found this book, which I recommend to you. It's in the bookstore, War and Gold. It's a little bit fat, but don't let that worry you. It's quite a interesting and interesting read. But I found myself wondering a lot about its impact on current situations. In particular, where I live these days in Boston, we spend a lot of time worrying about the costs of the so-called AFPAC war, the Afghanistan-Pakistan war that the United States has been waging, and what implications it has, and perhaps you have a reflection on that.
Absolutely.
And I'd love also to connect ultimately to his life as a member of parliament and how this speaks to it in both ways.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you take it away? Yeah.
That's very kind. I'm going to stand up, if I may, so that everyone can hear me. And I just wanted to talk a little bit. I'm very pleased to be back here. I was here 2 years ago, and I have to say that there's been a massive inflation in terms of crowd attendance. It's a much busier festival than it was when I first arrived, so I'm very grateful for that. So thank you all for coming. I wanted to just talk a bit about the background of my book and why I was thinking about war and gold and empires. I mean, if you cast your mind back to 2008, there was a world financial crisis. And everyone in the world was somehow connected with that. And if you're a historian, the first thing you do as a historian is you ask, how did we get here? How did we get to a situation where the whole world, it seemed, was on a precipice and about to sort of descend into chaos and the brink of financial disaster? And that, I think, was quite a fundamental question. And of course, as a historian, you always try and work back to the source. You're always trying to find out where the original seed was for this complete disaster. Now, most historians obviously love the past, and they can see the seeds of current turmoil and disturbance way back in the past. So, where do you start? Do you start with, in the Christian tradition, do you start with the Old Testament? In India, do you start with the Sanskrit legends, the Mahabharata, which we've been discussing? Where do you actually start? Well, I drew the line at about 1500 in terms of Western Europe. And what happened in 1500 was something very remarkable, which people in the Victorian age used to talk about the discovery of the New World. And of course, that New World and the discovery of the New World is very much from a Eurocentric point of view, because the people who were already in the New World, for them it was old. They were used to it. But of course, and I think when I talk to Indians, no people know about imperialism more than people in India. Even though it's a long time ago, the Raj, you still have in your history a very strong memory of that. And if it's not you, your fathers and your mothers, or your grandfathers and your grandmothers will have some experience of imperialism. Just as in my family, my parents grew up in what was called the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. And of course, my grandparents and my great-grandparents also were involved, had experience of empire. Now, why do I mention this? Because I think even though Africa and India had rapacious colonial empires foisted upon them in many ways, I think no empire was more stark, no episode of imperialism was more brutal in many ways than the Spanish discovery of the New World. Because what happened, they were called the conquistadors, and in many instances there were only about 1,000 conquistadors that were ever catalogued. I mean, it was a very, very small number of people, aged between about 20 and 40 in most instances. They were single men who really went out to seek their fortunes in South America, in Latin America. Now, how is this relevant to war and gold? What they were looking for, the one thing that they were looking for, well, there were three things that they were looking for, but I'm only going to talk about one of them. The three things they were looking for were God. They wanted to sort of sell their version of God. They wanted to bring glory to themselves so that their names would be remembered and they'd be famous and successful and people would write about them and they would have a sense of honor and prestige. And the third, and I would argue the most important thing they were looking for, was gold. Because what happened was that there was a huge demand for the metal, the precious metal. Because in Spain, Spain was waging wars, the emperor was waging wars, and he needed money to finance armies with which to defeat his enemies in Europe. And so there was a constant demand for money. And one of the things that happens when there's a constant demand for money is that young people, generally sometimes young men, I mean, you all know the phrase, "Go west, young man." There was a real drive for young people to seek adventure and military glory and when they conquered the Incas and the Aztecs. Now, those of you who know a little bit about this period I would suggest that the Spanish encounter with the Mesoameric civilizations, with the Incas and the Aztecs, was one of the most historically extraordinary episodes in man's story. Because you had two cultures that were totally disconnected, that had nothing to do with each other, essentially collide. And for the Incas and the Aztecs, it was a complete disaster, because they had very elaborate, very sophisticated civilizations, which were really ripped apart by this sudden incursion of the Spanish. And their descriptions of how, when the Incas saw the Spanish, they thought they were gods. They'd never seen Europeans before, they'd never seen white men before, they'd never seen horses before, they'd never seen artillery and guns and cannons. They'd never seen any of these things. And it was a complete shock. And not only were they militarily overawed, they also suffered from terrible diseases, which the Europeans, the Spanish, brought over. So in terms of for the Aztecs and the Incas, the advent of the Spanish was a complete disaster. For the economist, I hate to say it was a remarkable opportunity, because what happened was that gold and silver was essentially transported from the New World into Spain. And those of you who know Europe, those of you who've been to Spain, you may have been to Seville. And now Seville was the main port through which all the gold and silver, which the conquistadors discovered and they mined, and of course they didn't mine it themselves, they forced Indians to mine it for them. So that was a classic example of colonial exploitation. They forced Indians to mine gold and particularly silver, and it came into Europe. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating about being a historian is that you read other historians, you read what other economists, great minds, have written about the past. And I was very interested to discover, when I was trying to work out, the origins of kind of Western capitalism, if you like, I was very interested to discover a statement of John Maynard Keynes, the great British Cambridge-educated economist. And he said that the modern world essentially began with the Spanish discovery of the New World. And that was if I may, I'll try and find the passage, but it's a very key thing, and I think it's something that, if you've got to take away one thing, that's something that you should consider, because what happened was that the silver and gold coming in to Europe, according to Keynes, into Spain, essentially kick-started what he called the price inflation. So it meant that prices went up as with more money coming in. that was a great spur for industry. It means that shopkeepers can make money. Prices are going up. So when prices are going up, businessmen make money because they always sell at a higher price than what they bought. So it's almost like a virtuous cycle of economic growth. And I just wanted to read this very briefly. It was John Maynard Keynes who most frequently returned to the discovery of the Americas and their effect on the modern world. And this is him writing in 1930. In 1930, he wrote, "The modern age opened with the accumulation of capital, which began in the 16th century. I believe that this was initially due to the rise of prices and the profits to which that led. And this resulted from the treasure of gold and silver, which Spain brought from the New World into the Old." So that was and actually I'd started the book. I'd started that investigation from the Spanish discovery of the New World, and I found the quotation. It's always very nice when your prejudices are confirmed by much better minds, much more famous people. It's always a nice sign you're on a kind of right track. Now, the reason why Spain, we're not all speaking Spanish, and Spain didn't conquer the world, I would say, was that they were kind of fooled by their own wealth. They didn't build the institutions, they didn't build central banking, and they didn't have the institutions to which could actually use the gold and use the silver to its best effect. And the people who did that actually were the British. The British were very effective at using colonial wealth. That's because they had banks. They had a central bank in the Bank of England, which is still a very dominant player in the international financial scene. And there's a long story. I mean, it's probably another book, but there's a long story how the British developed banking, central banking. And like all best ideas, it was borrowed from someone else. It wasn't the British who invented central banking, it was the Dutch. It was the Bank of Amsterdam. And what happened was that all schoolboys used to learn this. There was a glorious revolution, and essentially we imported a Dutch king. And along with the Dutch king, this is in the late 17th century, we had Dutch financiers. Dutch expertise in trade and finance was really what helped Britain in the late 17th century develop this wonderful instrument called the Bank of England. Now, the Bank of England has been going on for about 320 years, and it's shrouded in mystery. It's one of these places that everyone knows and has heard of it, but it's something the operations of which are somewhat obscure. And the way it was structured at the beginning was very much like a private bank. And what Britain was very good at in those times was fighting wars. The British were very, very good and very successful and at fighting one country in particular, and that was France. So there was a panel, and they were trying to talk about British values, and there were these politicians. And after about 3 hours, they realized the only value that combined everyone in Britain was that they hate the French. That's the only. There was no other. Every other value was up for discussion. But these wars with France were really etched onto the British. This is even slightly before the imperial days. Was etched onto the British consciousness. And if you look at the imperial history of India from the British point of view, Clive of India and all those people, it was the French that were the first people really in southern India to try and get a foothold. And it was the British essentially who kind of removed them, even though they were in parallel. But these wars with France are very important to remember because, and this is where the financial engineering part is important. The population of France in 1700 was about 20 million. The population of Britain was only about 5 million. So even though today they're at the same parity, we think of England or Britain and France as roughly the same sort of country, you've got to remember that in 1700, when you read about all the battles and the imperial wars and the colonial contests and the 7 Years' War, all of that stuff, you've got to remember that France, in most of that period, outnumbers Britain 2, even 3, maybe sometimes 4 to 1. And so you've got to wonder, how does this country, which is only got a quarter of the population of France, how does it manage militarily to keep up with France? And the answer, I would say, and I mention it in the book, is because they had greater financial sophistication. So essentially, when the French wage wars, they do what modern governments do. They just borrow lots and lots of money, and they try and tax people. And because they're very inefficient borrowers, the lenders charge them at 10%. It's like, you know, today we have a Greek election tomorrow, and it's all about, a lot of the Greek election is about how they're going to pay their creditors and how they're going to manage their debts. Now, 18th century France was a classic case of a country where they did not have very sophisticated financial instruments, financial institutions, and so they borrowed money. The state was bankrupt a lot of the time. When Louis XIV died, the state was completely bankrupt. But in Britain, they had this thing called the Bank of England. And what the Bank of England, the whole point of the Bank of England, when it started, was to raise money for the government. So it raised, and it's an extraordinary thing. In 1694, which is 320 years ago, the Bank of England raised £1.2 million for the government. And it was a very elaborate process. So what they did is that they opened a subscription book, and it was in the middle of a chapel in London, because obviously the church was very important. And to people in those days, the church and money, they weren't so separate as now. So the subscription book was opened in the Mercer's chapel in London. And people would come in and they would sign their name, and they would pledge the amount of money that they were going to lend the government through the bank. And the first two names in the subscription book were the King and Queen. King William III and Queen Mary, they signed £10,000 each, which was an awful lot of money. So that was the £20,000. The bank raised 1.2 million in about 10 days. So there were all sorts of people, merchants, aristocrats, landowners, that subscribed this money. And the interest rate was 8%, which sounds like a lot, but actually, in the context of 1694, wasn't that much. So the government got its 1.2 million pounds. And if you look at the 1.4 trillion national debt started with this subscription. So right at the bottom of the debt is the £10,000 that King William III lent to his own government. And that's the beginning of the national debt. And so, you know, this episode is very important. I mean, obviously, you know, Britain is fighting France right through to Waterloo. And even in Waterloo, you know, the British are able to borrow money at a much lower rate. They're a much better credit than France. They've got these institutions, they can raise money, they pay bonds and gilts and all that sort of thing. And so they manage to raise money and pay for it much more cheaply. So it makes your war machine much more effective. So, you know, that's an important thing to remember. And the other important thing to remember at the time was that the British were very fixated with this idea of having a stable currency. And that stable currency was latterly known as the gold standard. So what does a gold standard mean? I mean, now you have rupees, we have pounds, it's all paper. But you know, back in the day, in your maybe grandparents, your great-grandparents' generation, that rupee, that pound, was backed by gold, and I think in the rupee's case, by silver. It was a silver standard. So in theory, you could go to the bank, get your piece of paper, and change it for gold and silver. And for the British, the gold standard was really the absolute pinnacle of financial rectitude, of financial prudence. And a gold standard, some people even today in America say we should go back maybe to the gold standard. But the gold standard is really what, if you look at the British Empire, and you look at the Victorian Empire, the 19th century, it was really underpinned by this incredibly stable currency system, and it was the gold standard. And interest rates were very stable. If you read Jane Austen, if you read Trollope, if you read all those novels, and you read between the lines, they always refer to people's income. If you pick it up, and you'll know that, I think it's Mr. Darcy, he's worth £30,000 a year, which is a princely sum. And the Bennets, I think, are worth £10,000 a year, or something like that. They're certainly not as much. And actually, I don't think it's even 10,000. They're much lower down the scale. But Jane Austen is always very careful, and the British writers of the 19th century were always acutely conscious of the kind of economic underpinnings of their society. And that was all about this thing called the gold standard. So what went wrong with the gold standard? What happened to Britain? Why did the British Empire finally sort of succumb? And this is where the war bit comes in. Because, of course, those of you who know about the 19th century will know that Britain and the great powers very rarely fought. In the 18th century, Britain had sort of fought its way to an empire, had defeated the French 3 or 4 times. Waterloo was the greatest moment. As far as Thackeray was concerned, that was the greatest moment in history. And he's endlessly talking about the Battle of Waterloo, if you read his books. That's the reference point. But of course, after the Battle of Waterloo, there was the imperial growth, but Britain wasn't actually fighting other European powers. And it was only with the First World War that we got into this cycle, very large cycle of debt. So the important thing to remember is that after 1815, Britain had huge debts, okay, huge debts. But they had the institutions to be able to pay for them. They had taxes. They had this thing called the gold standard. They were balancing the budget every year. So for 100 years, the British were essentially balancing the budget. By 1915, that debt, which was 2.5 times the size of the economy, had shrunk to be a quarter. That's because of the economic growth, the fact that they weren't adding to the borrowing. And so Britain entered the First World War 101 years ago, and the national debt was 726 million pounds. But in 1815, 100 years before that, it was 850 million. So the absolute amount over 100 years had gone down. And they patted themselves on the back. They say, we know about orthodox finance. We balance the budget every year. Half that budget was spent on defense. They didn't have any social security. They didn't have any health service or anything like that. It was a very kind of minimalist state where they were spending on war, on armaments, but these are small colonial wars, and they were balancing the books. What happens in the First World War was not only a military and a human disaster, it was also, in a very narrow sense, a financial disaster for Britain. Because with the advent of very mechanized war, with the ships, the amount of money you had to spend was astronomical. And they all thought the war would last 6 months, but it actually lasted 4 years. And I'm a House of Commons man, so anything, I love reading about the House of Commons, 100 years ago. And there's a very famous moment, well, for parliamentarians it's famous, maybe not to anyone else. But Lloyd George came and presented a wartime budget in December 1914. And he asked the House to pay for £2 billion, which was higher than anything that anyone had ever paid, lent the government before, in terms of, he tried to get $2 billion in taxation. And he describes this scene in the House of Commons. It's a late sitting, the sun's going down, they've had their dinner, he's opening the budget, and he says, please give me £2 billion, effectively. And he said he was amazed. The MPs just nodded it through. There was no discussion, because they were all committed to fighting that war. And to cut a long story short, in Britain, you had a situation where the national debt was 726 million, and it went up to 13 billion in 4 years. So that's something, it's a huge amount of money, it's 15 times more indebted. And so at this point, you've got a situation where Britain is indebted, you have a situation where the Germans are practically bankrupt because they were fighting the war, you have a situation where France was hugely indebted and lost most of it, 1 million of its young men. France was devastated after that First World War. And then, of course, you had a situation where the Americans entered the war right at the end. They hadn't spent the money, they hadn't really gone off the gold standard. And in my book, I argue, everyone talks about the Second World War being the birth of American dominance. I say no. If you look at the end of the First World War, if you look at what the First World War did to Europe, you will find that America's real dominance started as a consequence of the end of the First World War. And another thing that people always forget is that a lot of the markets in Europe were shut. So Ukraine used to be a great producer of grain. It still is, but that was where a lot of Europe got its grain. But of course, Russia was involved in the war, and so essentially the whole new markets were open to the American farmer, American manufacturing, and they exported all of this. They captured all these markets. And of course, they'd lent people money. And there's a very famous, incident where Stanley Baldwin, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, went to New York, and he had to negotiate a deal with the Americans because we'd lent them, the British had borrowed this money, and they, as the British always want to do, they wanted to get light terms. They said, look, we're good guys, we speak the same language, we're common cousins and all that sort of stuff. Give us a much easier loan. And of course, the Americans, like they always do, said, go take a hike. That was And there's a very famous incident where Calvin Coolidge, who was the president, the new president, he said, hang on, let me get this straight. So they'd had a very eloquent British presentation urging the Americans to reduce the rate of interest of the loan. And after about 20 minutes, Calvin Coolidge just said, hang on, let me get this straight, I don't get this. We lent them the money, didn't we? Meaning, look, we lent the money, we're going to get proper terms. And so Baldwin came back, and in those days, you couldn't fly to America. He came back by boat, and he came back to Southampton, and he did a sort of equivalent of a press conference. And he said, I didn't manage to get any concessions. This is what we're going to have to pay. And of course, as always happens in British politics, it was 6 weeks later he became prime minister. That was the fact that he didn't get this negotiation was forgotten. And there was a reshuffle. The prime minister had cancer. He resigned, and this man emerged as prime minister. And so I think that interwar period is a fascinating one. It's often overlooked. So in terms of the war element, I mean, Britain was exhausted in the First World War. And what we had to do, and I talk about it in the book, most of Britain's overseas wealth, a lot of it was obviously tied up in colonies like India, colonies in Africa. But a large portion of that wealth was invested in America. So if you looked at what British securities, what the British owned in America before the First World War, I mean, almost the entire American railroad had been financed by British capital. British capitalists had essentially bought shares to finance the building of the American railway. A lot of the early industrialization of factories and the American manufacturing base was relying on British investment. And what happened, because we had to pay for the First World War, is that Britain liquidated practically all its assets. All the British assets that were held in North America up to 1914 were liquidated. They were sold to get ready cash with which to pay for the war. So essentially, and that was a great thing for the Americans, because they said, look, we've got our capital back. We've got our, we now control our industry. And that, I think, was one of the seminal moments in terms of getting to where we got to. Now, obviously, the Second World War. So if you think about Britain in the Second World War, Britain had lots of assets going into the First World War. They were all sold. So we were kind of net even, in a way. Obviously, we had these loans, but in the Second World War, from a flat position, we got into huge debt because we were fighting the war right from the beginning. And that's one thing you notice if you're in England, is that it's always from 1939 to 45. And I remember as a child, I went to America, and it was always from 1941, because that's when they got in. I mean, the 39 to 41 bit they forget about. And so Britain was there right from the beginning and right to the end. And the same thing happened in the Second World War that happened in the First World War. Britain borrowed all this money from America. There was a loan negotiated. It was about £3.5 billion. I think £3.75 billion. Lord Keynes, who in his own view was the cleverest man in the world, went over there, he argued, he debated, he said it should be free, it should be a gift, because Britain's, and then they did all the kind of moral arguments that we're very good at in Britain. We were there right at the beginning, we saw it right through to the end, you must give us this money for free, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. What they said was that, and it was fairly, historians argue about it, I think it was quite generous. They said, look, we'll give you this loan, for the first 6 years you won't have to pay any interest, but then in 1951, 6 years on, you'll have to pay 2% a year. And so we've been paying 2% a year. I think we've just about paid it off now. But that was the deal. And of course, by 1945, and I think most economic historians would agree, the US was probably the greatest power the world has ever seen. Even now, the American economy, compared to the rest of the world, is not as strong as it was in 45. In 1945, American GDP was 50% of the global GDP. So 50% of the world's wealth was America. And if you look at those days, you look at the cinema, you look at this is the days of Coca-Cola exporting, McDonald's sort of gets going in the 50s, all these big global brands, before Google, before these big industrial brands, essentially kind of conquer the world in the period between about 1945 and 1960. And for anyone who was alive at that time, lots of the goods that the televisions, anything you had of stuff, the chances are was that it would be made in America. And so now at this point, you know, war on gold is very much looking at America. So where did it go wrong for America? I mean, in the 40s and 50s, they made everything. The car industry was dominant. Obviously, Coca-Cola, these are global brands. They have 50% of the world's wealth. And they're very old-fashioned in the way they approach the budget. They balance the books every year. And in fact, Truman, when they were fighting the Korean War, he's a Democrat. You know, he's supposed to be on the left. But he raises taxes to pay for the war. He doesn't borrow. He goes to Congress and says, look, we're going to have to raise taxes in order to pay for the Korean War. And the Congress says, yeah, that's fine. We will put up taxes to pay for this. And so when did this, and I was fascinated because I was, in the 2008 period, I was always reading about deficits and government debt and borrowing. And I was saying, so where did all the borrowing come from? Obviously in the war time they'd borrowed, but there was always this sense, even in the 40s and 50s, that you had to balance the books. And I looked at it and I discovered that the Vietnam War was kind of where the mood slightly shifted. Because again, like every single war, I mean, I don't know what you guys do, whether you're in politics or you're students or whatever you do, you've always got to be careful of wars because politicians always underestimate how long they will be, and they always underestimate how much they will cost. And usually, in terms of the money, it's a 10 times factor. So I was doing some stuff about colonial Burma in 1880, and they were writing saying, oh, this war will last 18 months and it will cost 100 million pounds. And of course, it's treble or 4 times that much, and it lasts 3 or 4 times as long. And Vietnam was very similar. And what happened in Vietnam was also there was a great lot of social tension in America. There were race riots. There was a social question about poverty. And so Lyndon Johnson wanted to start the Great Society. And what one politician said in the 30s, I think it was one of the Nazis, said, you can have guns or butter, but you can't have both. You can't have both guns and butter. And of course, in the 1960s, that's what America was trying to do. I mean, Lyndon Johnson said, this is a great country. We are rich enough to be able to fight this war, which he thought wasn't going to cost as much as it did, and, you know, provide for the Great Society. And it was really, I think, they weren't focused enough. They were trying to do everything, that they got into this habit of borrowing money. And at this point, obviously, you know, it's a part of the story is what I remember, that you remember the gold standard? Just as a little aside, I mean, Bretton Woods in 1944 basically reinstituted a kind of gold-linked currency. So the dollar, even as late as 71, the dollar you could exchange for gold. And have you ever seen Goldfinger? You've seen Goldfinger, the James Bond film. The whole point of that plot is that the gold reserves are in Fort Knox. And now, I mean, no one would care. I mean, so what? But Fort Knox was where the kind of was what underpinned the US dollar. And that's why in James Bond, it's a very scary plot line. Because what he's doing is he's trying to get the gold from Fort Knox. And as a consequence of that, the whole currency will collapse and there'll be economic turmoil. I mean, if that story happened now, no one would care. Okay, take the gold. I mean, what's the big deal? But the point about the plot in that film is that gold was absolutely inextricably bound with the currency system. And so for a monetary historian like me, someone who's interested in the history of money and finance, 1971 is a huge year. I know it's a big year in India because of you know, the war with Pakistan and Bangladesh and all the rest of it. But 1971 is a huge year in the history of the world economy. Because it's the first time, really, I would say in about 2,000 years, 2,500 years, where gold is no longer directly associated with a currency. And what happened was in 1971, if any of you have seen that terrible show, Bonanza, I mean, it's a terrible show about a horse and people out west. I mean, you don't need to worry yourself about that. But during Bonanza, the president, Nixon, came onto the television and said, basically said, I'm shutting the gold window. You will not be able to convert dollars into gold. I'm shutting that window and what had happened was that because people didn't trust the dollar, as soon as and these are countries, as soon as they got dollars, they went to the gold and they got the gold. So there was effectively a run on gold in the US. And there's a rumor, I've never seen it corroborated, that in the March of, this is in August 71 that he announces this, in March 71, the British apparently turned up to the US Treasury, metaphorically, with a check for $3 billion and said, we want this in gold. And as a consequence of that, they said, no, this is going to stop. And it stopped in 71. And essentially, since 1971, we've had these floating currencies. So the rupees that you have in your pocket, the sterling I have, all of that is paper money. It's not backed by any gold. I mean, even before 71, you could sort of translate, as it were. You could exchange your rupees and sterling into the dollar, and then you could get gold. So even though it wasn't a direct gold exchange, there was always a gold lurking in the background to underpin it. Well, anyway, the last sort of 45 years, 44 years, we haven't had that. And a lot of people, and I say this in my book, a lot of the causes of the instability, I think, can be traced to the fact that, it's a very abstract system of currency we have out there. It's very much based on trust. It's very much based on a sort of sense that maybe the government will help us out, will bail us out, and it's the government that's underpinning the currency. There's no objective standard. There's no gold, there's no silver, there's no objective currency standard underpinning this. And it does make it very fragile. And the other thing that I think it makes, and this is slightly more controversial, but it also means, as far as I'm concerned, that you can borrow more money. There's a lot more credit creation. Because what happens is that banks essentially and governments can create this money simply by sort of pressing a button and then, printing money. And, all sorts of credit markets in terms of people being able to go out and borrow money to buy houses, people being able to borrow money to buy refrigerators, people being able to borrow money to buy anything they want. This is called credit. And there's been a huge expansion in credit in the global economy, certainly ever since 1971. And it would be wrong for me to say that's the sole reason. There are lots of other reasons why credit can be created. But I think it's a factor. It's an important factor. And of course, credit, I mean, that's in a way is another American invention, because I was just wanted to tell you about the 1920s, obviously, were a great, and I could have talked a lot about the Depression, but the 1920s, you saw big credit creation as well. And the 1920s was the first time that you could buy on an installment plan. So you could, and it was really the car companies that set up easy credit, because they needed people to buy their cars. And a great big car is an expensive thing to buy. Not many people had the ready cash to go in and buy a car. So what General Motors and Ford did was that they set up finance companies, which would essentially lend people money, and you had an installment plan, you'd pay $20 a month, that kind of thing, and then after 2 or 3 years, maybe, you owned the car outright. And there are stories of people, because it was such an alien concept, there are stories of people who would pay, and they would only start driving after the 2 years, once they'd paid it off. Because then they said, now it's mine, I can drive it. Whereas before, they were paying. So credit's got a long story. Now,
shall we have a conversation now?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm going to do now is throw open the questions to the floor. I could talk forever. I'm very enthused, and you've been a very receptive audience. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Sorry? Yeah.
Was that all right?
No, it's good. We can. So, very engaging narrative story of the history of money, or a take on the history of money. One question that occurred to me, and you alluded to it at the beginning when you said that the Spaniards who brought the gold back, going back 500 years, did not build the institutions that were needed to couple this together. Why not? And more generally, if you think about lots of conflicts did not result in the creation of financial institutions throughout the world.
I think it's I think you've got to look at the nature of Spanish society to understand why they didn't have banking in the same way. I mean, the Italians had developed banking.
Right.
And of course, the Bank of Amsterdam was very famous. If any of you read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, I'm not saying it's a brilliant read, but it's a very important read. There's a big appendix or kind of subsection on the Bank of Amsterdam and how it worked, because it was such an important institution. And the one thing that you notice about banks is that they grow up in cities. You need an urban culture in which to have banks. The sorts of people who work in banks are middle-class people. Even in Renaissance Italy, the sorts of people, okay, the Medicis ended up being princes, but they start off being middle-class merchants. Now, if you look at the structure of Spanish society, and I'm simplifying, it's a very aristocratic society. It's a feudal society. You've got aristocrats and nobles at the top, and you've got a large number of peasants and serfs. It's an agricultural society. It doesn't have the sort of urban culture in which banking flourishes. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't. I mean, I tend to avoid Marxist history, but actually a kind of class interpretation, it does explain a lot, I think, in this particular instance.
Very interesting. So you mentioned in passing some of the recent conflicts and so on. Can you relate some of these stories in the narrative history to the AFPAC war the U.S. has been fighting?
Absolutely. I mean, I think...
and to your point, I mean, to your point about the systemic underestimation of the cost of conflict, that is, I think, Exhibit A.
Absolutely right. So if we look at the situation now, we're in 2015, 9/11 happened 13 and a half years ago, and essentially the United States has been involved in some form of armed conflict since then for 13 and a half years. And the cost of that has been huge. And also in my own country, we've been in a subsidiary kind of relationship almost. And we've been fighting these wars, and they've been very expensive. And at a time when obviously there are constraints on the budget, military spending is an extra drag on trying, if you're trying to balance the budget, the worst thing you can do is fight wars. And I think a lot of the reasons, I mean, I'm a slight cynic about this. A lot of the reason that we've seen this withdrawal is the fact that we've run out of money. We can't afford. And they say, well, it's, we're going to leave the Afghans to build their own country. But the bit we leave out is that we can't afford to be fighting these wars anymore.
Well, I think it's
I think it's very relevant. I mean, in terms of the book, I think it's incredibly relevant to what's happened before. And I think that one of the depressing things is that human nature never changes. We're always optimistic. We always get fooled by, we think that our enemies are hopeless and we're going to defeat them easily. We're always overconfident about ourselves. And this is sort of a pattern that is repeated.
So on that point of immutability of human nature, there is a book by another colleague of mine, Rogoff, and Carmen Reinhardt, on This Time It's Different,
That's right.
History of Debt. Can you relate the ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I love that book. I mean, that was a book that was published about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's about financial crises specifically, and showing how they have very similar characteristics. I mean, I'm a politician, I'm a government guy, so I always look at it from the point of view of government spending and government debt. And one of the things that politicians are very good at is that we're very good at promising things. And the only problem about promises is they cost money. And we're less good at finding the money from taxation, because that's the worst thing. It's like, if you want stuff, I can give you stuff, and you'll like me if I give you stuff. But if I say, hang on, you've got to pay for it, you might not like me as much. So we're very good at giving people things, but we're not very good at getting the money to pay for those. And of course, in a war situation, that exacerbates the debt.
I was also thinking about one of the other current conflicts in the news, the Russia-Ukraine situation in the Crimea. And it occurred to me, and I wonder if you agree with this, that there is a new kind of cost of conflict that was perhaps less in evidence 500 years ago or even 300 years ago, which is the loss of confidence in someone's currency and someone's state of affairs. If you look at what Mr. Putin has subjected his people to, it's essentially a collapse in the ruble being the most proximate indicator of that, but also a generalized run on the sentiment of Russia.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why you all have to buy the book, because I do talk about this. I just didn't manage to talk about it in my introductory remarks. I mean, if you look at what happened after the French Revolution, the French revolutionary government essentially had to finance itself, because what had happened, to cut a long story short, they had a revolution, they executed Louis XVI, and essentially every country in Europe, and they were all monarchies, sort of ganged up on the French. They wanted to crush the French Revolution. And so what they did was that they had conscription, but of course they had to pay for the war machine. So they essentially reverted to paper money, because they thought, well, we might as well print the money. And of course the Americans did the same thing when they fought the British in the American War of Independence. They printed money. And if you look at the American Constitution, there's a thing saying that gold and silver will be the money. That's because they remembered the chaos of the Revolutionary War, where they were printing money. There's a long history of economic collapse.
But the loss in confidence that comes by somebody dumping the ruble now because that has a parallel as well?
I think it does. I mean, another thing that happens when you have wars, and this happened with the British, is that people no longer want to hold your currency. And so when they know, and this is what happened, this is why Nixon shut the gold window.
Yeah.
Because they were fighting wars, they weren't running balanced budgets, and people were dumping dollars for gold. And so it's always part of an intertwined thing, really.
It's quite extraordinary how what goes around comes around over and over again.
Absolutely.
It really is fascinating. Shall we open it up? And if you could ask a question as opposed to your life history, that would be great. The lady
Not that I'm
there,
not interested in your life history, but I think
it's
we're
very
limited
interesting.
for time.
Kwasi will buy you a drink after for your life history. The lady in the blue scarf here.
Hi, can you hear me? I have two questions, but just a comment. I think that Indian women in the South African government might be quite upset about
Can you hear?
What? I can't hear you really.
We can't hear
Sorry,
you.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I just wanted to say that I think Indian women in the South African government might be quite unhappy about the gold reserves in Fort Knox glutting the market and reducing the value of their gold. But,
Okay.
but my two questions are about the New Deal and what role it had in establishing the American government as more stable and the American economy as more stable than everybody else.
The New Deal in the 30s.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, conversely, after the Second World War, the American cities weren't destroyed, whereas a lot of European cities were destroyed and a lot of
That's
Japanese cities were destroyed, and so they had to rebuild their infrastructure, so like their industrial areas
Absolutely
and
right.
electrical systems and all the rest of it. And that means that to a large extent the American infrastructure is old and
Sure.
outdated. And you know, so if you have a comment on that.
I mean, the New Deal is quite controversial. I think it probably did help rebuild America. And of course, it totally changed the nature of the relationship of the American government to the individual. And a lot of people, a lot of conservatives were very, very skeptical about the New Deal as it was being passed, because they felt that the state was getting too involved in the life of the country. And of course, on the left, they were saying, well, of course the state had to get involved in the life of the country because the economy had collapsed. So, and you still get these debates running even now. I mean, there's always a question of to what extent should the state step in and bail companies out, bail banks out? To what extent should the state, you know, spend money on good works to boost employment and that sort of thing? And I think there's no doubt that some of the New Deal's success, you know, was real. And also, if you look at, you know, the Nazis, I mean, they were spending huge amounts of money on infrastructure projects, on roads. They built those beautiful motorways, and all of that was to boost employment. So they were kind of almost like, they were like Keynesians before Keynes. I mean, before the general theory, a lot of governments had kind of stumbled into, if you like, those kind of, you know, reflationary policies. And I think it's complicated. I think they can work in limited instances.
But you know, if I may, just on that, the extent to which the U.S. government got involved post 2008 in bailing out people seems to me to have been qualitatively different, right, in a sense, because it was with a very defined plan to exit.
That's right.
That involvement, as opposed to the New Deal, which was the creation of a whole set of systemic institutions.
Yeah, I mean, and also the New Deal, another thing about the New Deal was that it was very much based on actual projects. I mean, they built a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
People actually got shovels and had jobs, and they put their, you know, it was sort of what we used to call elbow grease, you know, into work. Whereas these bailouts have been much more on the kind of financial sector in terms of, they haven't really spent, I mean, actually, I think at the beginning of the crisis, Krugman was saying, the eminent American economist, he was advocating these kind of New Deal projects. He was talking about a kind of Keynesian stimulus where you're actually properly investing in physical stuff. Going back to your question, I mean, this is a fascinating point about American industry and European and Japanese industry. After 45, most of Western Europe had been devastated physically. Japan had been physically wrecked. I mean, if you can imagine, 2 atomic bombs had landed in Japan. And so the physical infrastructure had been completely destroyed. Now, in Germany and Japan, they were essentially American colonies. I mean, if you look at Japan, there was a guy called Douglas MacArthur, who was essentially a kind of, almost a sort of warlord, almost like an emperor figure in Japan. And so a lot of that rebuild was under and for 7 years, Japan was under American rule. And MacArthur, I mean, you've got to read a history about him. He was like a celebrity god in Japan. I mean, women were, would send him their underpants, and say they wanted to bear his children. I mean, he had this sort of mythic power. And why I say that is that, the reconstruction of Western Europe and Japan was very much under the kind of American umbrella. And that's something I obviously could have mentioned in the original talk.
Lady at the bottom, in the aisle. Go ahead.
You're at the IQ panel on the 7 deadly sins, and I was wondering what sin you feel you represent. My money is on sloth, but I was curious on your take.
What is it?
Sorry, I really couldn't hear. The acoustics are not so great. Could you try again? Something about the 7 deadly sins? Yeah.
Right. Which sin do you think you are? My money is on sloth.
The deadly sins. Yeah, I mean, I think war and gold. So there's clearly avarice involved, and pride. I think. I mean, in terms of war. That's pride. Human pride is really probably a big factor in war, in terms of you're trying to defend your honor, or you're trying to project power and maintain your influence and your standing. I mean, and going back to the First World War, which is very much in our thoughts given the centenary that happened last year. I mean, the reason why Britain entered the war technically in the First World War was because of a treaty signed in 1839. Preserving the neutrality of Belgium. Now that seems like quite a kind of, almost like a footling, very, very kind of legally technical matter. And even at the time, the Germans are saying, what, the British are going to go to war on a scrap of paper? That was the question they asked. And the British said, yeah, this is our honor. This is what we've, this is what we've signed up to. We've signed up to protect Belgian neutrality, even though it was 75 years ago. It was in 1839 that this treaty was signed. And we felt honor bound to go into the war.
Except in this case, the greed sometimes results in good institutions.
In good institutions, sometimes. But the institutions, I mean, that are set up, I mean, it's almost like a sort of vicious cycle because the institutions make you very good at waging war. If you see what I mean? So it kind of feeds itself.
Okay. The gentleman with the white shirt, on the left. Sure, that's fine.
Okay. I have lots of questions though, but I'll ask
just
one.
Pick one.
Yeah, just pick one. So, given sort of the older sort of format of empire building and the more modern format of that, which is nation building, do you see commonalities between the approaches being taken between the two, or are they very vastly different?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I talked a lot about it in my first book, Ghosts of Empire. And even though I'm sort of mildly critical of the British Empire for lots of reasons, one thing that the British were good at was that they were good at sending people who spent a lot of time in these countries. So if you look at even in the Iraq Mandate, or certainly in India, there were people who spent their whole lives. There were British people, and even in Ghana, I have a friend who's a historian, and his father was in what was then the Gold Coast for 45 years. And they would go and they would spend their time there, and they would learn languages and get involved. Even though they were imperialists, they kind of had some sort of interest, curiosity, some of them, in the cultures that they were sent to rule in many ways. The problem I think we've had with modern adventures is that the level of commitment is much lower. The level of language learning is much lower. The time scale is much shorter. And so I think it's very difficult to, if you're going to go down that route, I don't think there's the expertise is there necessarily. So the thing that America has had to deal with, and Western countries, is, we're neither one thing or the other. On the one hand, we don't have the resources or the expertise or the patience really to try and do nation building. But on the other, we can't just not get involved. So we're doing, if you look at Libya, if you look at Iraq, if you look at all these places, we've kind of gone in, done a thing, and then tried to get out. And we've left a difficult situation. So we've been neither one thing or the other. We get involved, but we don't really see it through.
That's a tough position to be in, though. I mean, there's a little bit of arrogance there also, right?
To get involved?
Well, to go and say that you can do a little bit of nation building without the deep immersion, but then the deep immersion doesn't endear you to the population at all.
No, and the deep immersion I don't think that deep immersion is feasible in the modern world. I don't think having 10,000 troops in Iraq, American troops in Iraq, for 30 years.
Well, would the would the native Ghanaian or the Gold Coast person have appreciated long tenures of the British there, or the native Indian, other than the Maharaja?
No, I don't think they appreciated it, but at least they were talking about something they knew about, to some degree.
At the back, I can't see very well from here with the lights. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Fascinating talk, especially the relations between Britain and America, World War I and II. Do you see some parallels between the current China-America situation where the debt is now,
It's a brilliant question. I mean, I didn't talk about China, but my whole last chapter is about, actually my last 2 or 3 chapters are about China and its influence. And I was talking about the gold standard. I think if the gold standard were ever to come back, it would be through the Chinese. Because if you look at what happened in the 19th century, Britain was a great exporter of goods, and they were getting currency, and they had a gold standard. And in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, until the sort of 1970s, America was a great exporter, and they were getting revenues in, and they had this gold standard. And China, in terms of the export machine of the world, really, is in an analogous position to Britain in the 19th century and to America in the 20th century in that particular instance. Now, of course, it's a totally different political establishment, a totally different set of political rules. But just if you look at the kind of narrow trade strategy that they're operating, it's not that different from these two countries. But I think and also another key feature is that just China became essentially a lender to America. So, I was talking about vendor financing. That's like China. China is like General Motors. I mean, they're making stuff and they're lending money to the Americans so that they could buy them back, right? So that's very much that kind of model. But I think as China gets richer, I think, having a low-wage export growth model might not be the way forward in terms of developing their economy further. There's this woman over there.
Is there somebody in the front? No.
You in the front?
Yeah, go ahead. The lady in the pink, I couldn't see her from here.
How many questions?
A couple more, maybe.
Hi. Actually, I just was not able to connect how America got out of its 1931 depression to actually go to war as well. That was just like the part was really confusing.
Okay, so what happens? There's a Great Depression in 1929. So for 3 or 4 years, the American economy is contracting. And it was a very, very tough period. I mean, lots and lots of people were unemployed. Roosevelt brings in the New Deal where he tries to resuscitate the American economy. But then again, there are lots of arguments about this. But the fact is, in about 36 or 37, he tries to balance the budget. And then there was a minor return to the Depression. It was a kind of recession, if you like. And a lot of the left would say, well, he tried to balance the budget, and that's why it went into depression, into a recession. And there are arguments about that. But there's no doubt that the Second World War really boosted the American economy because essentially the demand on the goods. And you watch these documentaries, and there was this ship, I can't remember, they built it in a day. They built this warship. The machine got so good, it was so well oiled, that by the 44, 43, the American industrial machine was just pouring out these goods. And there was no way the Nazis could win. I mean, there was no, at that point where the full scale of American industry was focusing on the war. That was it. I mean, and the British knew that. Once the American industrial might got going, that was it. There was no way that the Nazis were going to win, or the Japanese.
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Is there a mic here?
I was wondering if you could complete the loop between, you ended off talking about the gold standard.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could tie in to modern day financial crisis, like the major banks.
Oh yeah. Okay. Let's talk. I mean, and I didn't get to this point because there was a limitation of time. But if you look at what's happened in the last 20, and this is my own account of it, I think there was huge credit creation. Largely because you've got an unfettered system where banks can create money, they can lend money, and you had a situation where subprime mortgages, and they had, ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets, and the people would lend you money, and of course, 2 years down the line, you couldn't pay it back, and the assets blew up because there was such a demand for people to, and that's how, if you look at I mean, it's very complicated. We could talk, it's not that complicated, but we could talk a long time about it. You had a very low interest rate environment, okay, for historic reasons. You know, you're getting 2%, and you're a banker in the Midwest, in Iowa, and you're thinking, I don't want to invest in treasuries. I don't want to invest in U.S. government debt. That's going to pay me 2% over 30 years. What's the point of that? I need a higher return for my money. And then some guy in New York is inventing this mortgage where you can get 6 or 7%. And you're thinking, I can either lend, you know, this Mexican guy at 6% who's not going to pay back, or I can lend the US government at 2% in 30 years. And I'm being paid in terms of the deals I'm doing and the returns I'm getting. And in 2 years' time, I'll probably have left the bank anyway and I'll be doing something else. So it's very short term, right? And that's why, and we call this the search for yield. In a very low interest rate environment, you're looking for yield. You're looking to get a 4, 5, maybe 6% return. And once you've got that driver, you can do some very stupid things in order to get that yield. And I'm afraid that this is what happened, sort of 10 years ago, in the last sort of 10 years. There was this search for yield, and I would say that appetite was satisfied by these products, which were giving, which were giving good yields. But of course, the base of it was phony. And I think what I would say, people who really are into the gold standard would say, you can't do credit creation like that if you've got a gold standard. You can't simply just make money out of nothing. And that's where this argument. Personally, I think the gold standard is impractical. And I think that's almost a side issue. But some kind of slightly way out there people think that it could come back.
If we had time, we would keep going. Fascinating romp through a very, very long period of time. And I would have loved to ask you questions about your current time in Parliament and how the historical sensibility influences it. But for another time.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Kwasi for a lovely, lovely session.
Thank you. That's very good.
Please join me in thanking once again our speakers, Kwasi Kwarteng and Tarun Khanna, as well as our sponsor for this session, the Indian Quarterly. Kwasi Kwarteng will be signing books in the book signing tent, which is out of Durbar Hall and then to the left, if you would like to go and get your book signed by him. Thank you.